Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the families of those that died in the Grenfell fire have, for the last time, paid moving tribute to their loved ones at the official inquiry. It was the 7th and final day of the hearings devoted to the survivors and victims of the fire, which claimed 72 lives. Meanwhile, a report by the charity Muslim Aid has said the immediate response by the local authority, Kensington and Chelsea Council, was badly flawed. Fatima Manji reports.
Our mum lost her life not only to the fire that night, but to the corporate negligence by the very people who were to ensure her safety.
Sakina Afrasiabi was housed on the 18th floor of Grenfell Tower, despite being disabled. Her daughter believes it wasn't just the fire that killed her that night.
The discrimination and failure in duty of care by the housing allocations team, which resulted in a vulnerable, physically disabled and partially sighted pensioner to be housed on the 18th floor of a tower block, equally took the life of my mum.
On that fateful night,
Raymond Bernard was on the very top floor. His sister explained how 7 people were found inside his flat, all trying to flee the fire.
As there was no way down to escape, the only alternative was to head towards the top floor. There they met Ray and took refuge in his flat. And we know that he would have given comfort to each of them before they took their last breaths and departed this world.
In the final day of family tributes, the inquiry also heard from Hamdan El-Ilami. He lost his daughter, son-in-law and grandchildren.
That time, Farah, my daughter, hugged me, and I didn't know that that night was the night when they will die.
He said their deaths had left him torn to pieces.
Thank you very much for coming to talk to us.
Throughout the week, survivors and those who've lost loved ones have been giving testimony. They've shared memories of happier times.
The 21st floor was so much more fun and child-friendly than the 9th floor, where I lived. Mehdi was the baby of the family. He wasn't a spoiled boy, but he was cared for a lot. I often visited my cousin Mehdi, and we would play on the landing with his neighbours.
They've spoken of their grief and trauma.
He looked like he was just sleeping, as babies do. You know, at that moment, we felt like our hearts had broken.
And they've expressed their anger at the authorities and fire service.
I want to know why I was physically stopped from leaving the flat at about 2 a.m. Why were we kept inside for so long? What was responsible for that recession? I want answer. If I had not listened to the fire brigade, my son would have been likely alive today.
I hope that we can get to the truth.
Meanwhile, the charity Muslim Aid launched their review of the voluntary sector's response to Grenfell, saying charities had to step up because authorities fell short.
The chaos that we saw here in the UK was worse than actually some international disasters, because as international agencies we've seen humanitarian responses better coordinated abroad.
The review found weak leadership in the response made the disaster worse.
Lord Bourne, we've heard today about the voluntary sector stepping in where they felt local and national government was lacking. Why was there that vacuum?
Well, first of all, what happened nearly a year ago in Grenfell, a year on, we're looking at something that was unprecedented. Everybody was crushed by it. Even the voluntary organisations were crushed by it, as they've just said. But local organisations in these awful crises are always there, much more trusted, much more local, much more responsive than either central or local government. We need to pick up lessons from this.
Kensington and Chelsea Council told us they will be rightly held to account by the inquiry and justice will out.
Now, joining us now is Jahangir Malik, who is the Chief Executive of the charity Muslim Aid, and very critical you've been of the responses of particularly the local authority and some charities. But you've just heard from Lord Bourne, the Under-Secretary of the Housing Department, that really, well, it's OK because you lot are around and can pick up the pieces.
Well, we as a charity sector had to step up to the mark because there was a void, a vacuum and a gap. So the report that we launched today is called Mind the Gap, and the gap is between what the statutory authority failed to do and the needs of the people on the ground. Somebody had to do that, and we, as a charity sector, stepped up, working with the local organisations in and around Grenfell, provided the desperately needed assistance that was non-existent.
In simple terms, what did the statutory authorities fail to do as a first response?
As a first response, there was a complete lack of ownership, leadership. Any political leadership, it was completely chaotic scenes. True, it was an unprecedented disaster that we haven't witnessed the scale of before in the United Kingdom from probably the Second World War. But the level of response, the slowness and the ability to not be able to cope with such a magnitude was telling of our emergency services, in all honesty, and therefore organisations like ourselves working with locals had to step in.
In the immediate aftermath, the fire brigade, I mean, were they slow attending, or basically, I mean, we know what the criticisms were about getting people to stay in their flats.
That's right.
But actually attending to the fire.
I think the fire brigade, did the best that they could do, because it was a situation that was unfolding by the minute and by the hour. Once again, nobody really could have predicted the scale and the magnitude of it. So the fire brigade did a sterling job in trying to get themselves across and to do and save as many lives as possible. But it was all very chaotic.
Where did the voluntary sector fail?
So the voluntary sector stepped into a vacuum, and in that vacuum tried to play the role that they can. Thousands of volunteers, if you remember back in June the 14th, turned up en masse into centres, the mosque, the churches, the Portobello Trust, and almost overwhelmed the centres with their empathy and support.
There was no central organisation of any sort.
There was no central command of any sort, and the charity sector did its bit, and often that created duplication and all sorts of chaos.
I mean, it's a crude question. Should they have put a general in? I mean, should they have put somebody in from the military to try and organise it?
I think the report highlights the lessons that we need to have learnt in such a disaster. And there are many lessons to learn. One of the ones, for sure, is the coordination mechanisms that need to be in place. Recognising that voluntary organisations are deeply rooted within constituencies, are well placed to be first responders, and they are a necessary piece of the puzzle that need to be in the emergency response moving forward.
And a very simple final question. If this happens again, will people be ready?
I hope so. I hope that the authorities, the government, the central government, and even the charity sector itself has a good, long, hard look at itself and its response, and takes the time to review its response and say, what can we do better, and make those recommendations, and hope and pray that we'll be in a better position.
Jahangir Malik, thank you very much indeed for coming in.